If you had to choose between honor and love, which would you choose? I ask, because not everyone has the luxury to choose both. Some of us are born into places where the church bell rings louder than our own thoughts, where a father's word carries more weight than a woman's desire, and where love, if it dares bloom, must do so in the dark, like honeysuckle under moonlight, clinging to fences that were never meant to let it grow. This story ain't just about the West. It's about a girl named Ruth. And it's about me, about the scent of blood and honeysuckle that still clings to the edge of memory like a ghost that never learned how to leave. Back then, Calico Creek wasn't much more than a handful of buildings that stood stubborn against the wind. One dusty church, one tired saloon, a jailhouse that hadn't seen a real outlaw in years, and the sheriff's house, whitewashed, upright, and filled with silence. That's where Ruth Tucker lived, the preacher's daughter, the sheriff's pride. She moved like she'd been taught to never make a sound. Back straight, eyes low, hands folded. Sundays, she played the organ with a grace that made the air itself sit still. Folks in town called her an angel, pure, obedient, untouched by sin. But if you looked close, closer than most dared, you'd see something behind her eyes, like a flicker of lightning behind a summer cloud, like she was waiting for something she couldn't name. And then Maura came to town. The first time I saw her, she walked into the saloon like she owned it, but not with arrogance. It was survival. She had a voice like whiskey left too long in the sun, low, warm, a little bitter. Her dress clung in places that drew whispers, and her laughter curled through smoke and dust, like sin itself was dancing. She didn't belong here, and she knew it. But she wasn't trying to belong. She was just trying to breathe. They said she'd come from the East, running from something or someone, depending on who you asked. No family, no husband, no explanation. Just a box of sheet music, and a gun she kept under the bar piano, wrapped in velvet like a keepsake. Ruth first saw her from across the street. It was a Thursday. I remember because the wind had kicked up that day, and the sky was smeared with orange dusk. Ruth stood outside the general store, basket in hand, staring at Maura through the saloon window like she was watching a fire she wasn't allowed to touch. And Maura looked back. It wasn't a smile. Not at first. Just a glance, measured, curious, soft around the edges. The kind of look that lingers longer than it should. The kind of look you feel in your chest long after it's passed. After that day, Ruth started walking slower past the saloon. Twice, she dropped her handkerchief at the steps, and each time, Maura picked it up. Once with a wink, once with silence. Both times, Ruth looked like she might cry, or run, or both. People noticed, of course. You can't blink in Calico Creek without someone naming it sin or salvation. The sheriff, Ruth's father, watched her closer. The reverend preached louder. Temptation wears many faces, he said, and not all of them are men. But Ruth kept walking past, kept listening from a distance, kept dreaming, maybe, of music that wasn't hymns, and eyes that didn't belong to the Lord. Me, I just watched and remembered. Because once, a long time ago, I was Ruth. And once, I loved someone like Maura. Someone with danger on their skin and kindness buried underneath. Someone I should have run from, but didn't. And just like then, I could see it coming. The pull between honor and heart. The slow unraveling. The hush of something forbidden, beautiful, and doomed. Love out here, real love, don't ride in like a white horse. It creeps in like shadow. It clings like dust. And when it blooms, it don't ask for permission. It just grows, even when it knows it's going to die. So I watched Ruth that night. She walked into the saloon for the first time. Alone. Hair down. Dress plain but clean. Her hands shook. Her voice cracked when she asked Mora for a song. And Mora, for the first time since she'd arrived in Calico Creek, looked scared. Not of Ruth's father, not of the town, but of hope. Because when you've been broken enough times, hope ain't a comfort. It's a threat. It's a reminder of how much you have left to lose. But Mora played. A soft tune. Something that sounded like rain on windows you can't close. And Ruth stood there, eyes full of storm, mouth trembling like a confession she couldn't say out loud. That's how it began, with a song, a stolen glance, and the scent of honeysuckle in the air. But nothing in the West stays soft for long, and the blood, well, that comes later. If you had to walk away from everything you were raised to believe, your family name, your God, the way the world sees you, for love, would you do it? Or would you stay and let it rot inside you, quiet and polite, like a prayer never said out loud? I've asked myself that same thing more times than I can count, and I still don't have the answer. But I know what Ruth chose. Or maybe it's better to say, I know what chose her. After that first night in the saloon, Ruth didn't sleep. I could see it on her face the next morning, standing next to her father at the church steps, eyes glassy, lips chapped from worry. The preacher spoke about obedience and temptation, same as every Sunday, and Ruth nodded at all the right places. But her soul was somewhere else, somewhere warm and golden, with a voice that hummed like piano keys and fingers that had never judged her. Maura and Mora? She tried to hide it at first. She played faster, drank slower, said less. But even the drunks in the corner noticed how her eyes kept drifting toward the door, as if she was waiting for something impossible, something pure, something good. You see, Mora was used to men, used to their noise, their breath, their hands, their promises. She could smell lies before they left a man's mouth. But Ruth was untouched in every way that mattered. Honest like spring water, soft like old lace. She wasn't a woman who lied. She was a woman who'd never been allowed to speak. That's what made it dangerous. Because love like that, it doesn't sneak in. It crashes. The second time they spoke, really spoke, was behind the saloon, near the old honeysuckle vines that climbed the back wall. It was late. The town was asleep, but the moon was high and loud enough to see every tremble in their hands. Ruth had followed the music again. She waited until the last drunk stumbled out, until the lights went low and the dust began to settle. Then she knocked, soft, like she was scared of her own heartbeat. Mora opened the door, her hair down, boots off. No corset, no red lips. Just Mora, tired, bare, and suddenly afraid. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, not angry, just stunned. Ruth didn't answer at first. She stepped inside, closed the door behind her, like she'd already made the decision and was just waiting for the pain to follow. Then she said, "I needed to see you." And Mora, God, she looked like someone had hit her square in the chest. There was no kiss that night. No fevered embrace like in those dime novels women keep under their pillows. Just two souls sitting on the floor, backs against the wall, knees nearly touching. Ruth told her about the pressure of being the preacher's daughter, the quiet expectations, the dead air in her lungs, and Mora. She didn't say much, just listened, like no one ever had. That night, the honeysuckle bloomed early. Its scent hung thick in the air, sweet and sad. I remember because that smell still hits me sometimes, random, cruel, and brings everything back. The dust, the candlelight, the weight of silence between two people trying not to fall in love. But they were already falling. The town, of course, began to murmur. The sheriff's daughter seen near the saloon, Ruth's skirts dusty in the morning, a scarf left behind, a song Mora played that sounded too tender to be just a tune. They didn't understand it, but they felt it, the shift, the pull. Honor is a funny thing out here. It doesn't mean goodness. It means reputation. It means keeping your hands clean while your soul bleeds behind closed doors. It means pretending the world is flat and simple, even when your heart tells you otherwise. Ruth's father started watching her like a hawk, called her in earlier, read more scripture at dinner. One night, he followed her, didn't say a word, just rode behind her like a shadow as she walked the dirt road toward the saloon. She never made it that night, but Mora waited anyway. Sat by the piano in the dark, fingers still, looking toward the door with hope gnawing at her like an old wound. She waited until the candle burned out. That's how it went for a while. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Every moment they stole was followed by one they lost. And still, they kept trying, like fools, like women who hadn't yet learned how sharp the world can cut. Because when love is forbidden, it becomes holy. Every glance is a psalm. Every touch is a prayer. Every lie you tell to protect it feels like a sin and a salvation all at once. I remember the night they held hands for the first time, really held hands. It was after church. Ruth had slipped away from the crowd, down behind the stables, where Mora waited with shaking fingers and a storm in her eyes. They didn't speak, just stood there, breath steaming in the cold. And Ruth reached out, slowly, like she thought the world might end if she did it wrong, and laced her fingers through Mora's. And for a moment, the world did end. The wind stopped. The stars held still. Even the dust in the air seemed to pause. And I thought, maybe they could make it. Maybe love, real love, could survive out here. But the West doesn't let things stay soft. Not for long. And honeysuckle, no matter how sweet, still grows on fences made to keep people apart. If you had to lie to everyone you loved, just to be with the one person who made you feel alive, would you? Would you risk your name, your soul, your blood, for a few stolen moments in the dark? I've known what it's like to hold someone's hand and still feel like you're hiding. I've known the ache of loving someone you can't talk about. Not at the dinner table, not in the street, not even in prayer. And Ruth knew that ache too well. After the night behind the stables, something inside her cracked open. She still walked with her head down, still played the church organ each Sunday, still kissed her father's cheek after supper. But there was a fire in her now, not wild, not reckless, quiet, controlled, like a lamp burning in a cellar where no one could see the light unless they knew where to look. She started leaving notes, tiny scraps of paper pressed into the hollow of a tree behind the livery. Mora would pick them up the next day, tuck them into her corset, read them in the back room between whiskey breaks and piano songs. They weren't love letters, not at first, just observations, questions. Ruth would write things like, Do you ever think about the ocean? Did you always know who you were? Is it wrong to want more than what you're given? And Mora would answer with short replies in smudged charcoal. Yes, but it scares me. No, but I learned the hard way. No, it's wrong to pretend you don't. That was how their love grew, not with declarations, but with honesty, with questions no one else had ever bothered to ask. Their meetings were short, careful, often no more than 5 minutes behind the dry goods store or in the shadows of the churchyard. But in those minutes, time seemed to stretch. The way Mora touched Ruth's wrist before letting go. The way Ruth looked back before walking away, like she was memorizing the shape of Mora's face against the dusk. Love like that isn't about passion, not at first. It's about permission, about allowing yourself to feel what the world tells you not to. Mora was older. She'd been through hell in corsets and card games. She knew better than to believe in fairy tales. But Ruth made her hope. That was the dangerous part. And Ruth? She was changing. The girl who used to say yes, sir, to every command started saying maybe. She lingered in silence more. She stared out windows like she was planning her escape. She didn't hate her father, not yet, but she stopped fearing him. That was the first fracture. The town didn't say anything out loud, but it was there in the eyes of the butcher's wife, in the longer prayers at the Sunday pulpit, in the way no one spoke Mora's name anymore. They just said that woman, like her presence was a disease everyone was trying not to catch. But love makes people bold, even the quiet ones. One evening, Ruth came into the saloon through the back, cloaked and nervous, her cheeks red from the wind. Mora was cleaning up after the night's songs, sleeves rolled, eyes tired. Ruth locked the door behind her. Mora looked up, surprised. "What are you doing?" she asked, voice low. "I wanted—" Ruth paused. "I don't know what I want, but I couldn't go another day pretending I didn't." They stood there, 10 feet apart, the floor between them thick with dust and unsaid things. Mora set down the rag in her hand and walked over, slow, like one wrong move might break everything. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I know. If your father finds out, he'll try to save me." Mora's eyes searched Ruth's face, waiting for her to flinch. She didn't, and that night they kissed. It wasn't fire. It wasn't thunder. It was soft, careful, like two people who didn't want to hurt each other, but already knew they would. Afterward, they sat on the piano bench, shoulder to shoulder, listening to the wind push against the windows. Mora played a single note, then another, and Ruth closed her eyes, and in that moment it felt like maybe, just maybe, they could keep this going, hide in the seams of the town, find pockets of silence where their love could breathe. But silence doesn't last in a place like Calico Creek. One morning, Ruth found a dead bird on her doorstep. A crow, its neck twisted, its wings tied with red ribbon. A warning. Someone knew. She didn't tell Mora. Not then. She burned the bird out behind the woodshed and told herself it was just coincidence. But deep down, she knew the wind was changing, and the choice she feared was coming. Honor or love, blood or honeysuckle. Because the West always asks the same question sooner or later. Who are you willing to bleed for? And Ruth was running out of time to answer. If the price of love was violence, would you still take it? If your heart pointed one way but your blood pulled the other, how far would you go before something broke that couldn't be mended? I've seen what happens when a woman is torn in two, between the life she's been given and the life she dares to want. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, A slow unraveling, a look that lingers too long, a question left unanswered, a truth held too tightly until it crushes the bones that carry it. That's what was happening to Ruth. She smiled less, slept even less. Her skin went pale, and the bags under her eyes grew darker by the day. Her father took notice. "You sick girl?" he asked once, sharp like a knife that didn't care who it cut. She shook her head and went on peeling potatoes, though her hands were trembling. In the stillness of her room, she clutched the notes Mora had written, soft, stained with fingerprints and faint pencil marks. "You are not wrong for wanting." She read that line over and over, like a prayer meant only for her. But the world doesn't give quiet girls the space to dream, and secrets, no matter how carefully tended, always find their way into the open. It was a Thursday night, cold enough to make the windows sing. Mora had stayed late after closing, practicing a hymn Ruth once said she loved. She was alone in the saloon, lantern burning low, dress loosened at the back, when the door creaked open. She didn't turn, not at first, just smiled and said, "You're late." But it wasn't Ruth. It was Amos Cutter, a man who'd been watching from the shadows for weeks. He'd worked the telegraph lines before the railroad passed him by. Now he just drank and wandered and looked too closely at things that weren't his. And he didn't like Mora. Didn't like how she walked like she owned her skin. Didn't like how she looked at Ruth. He stepped inside, slow, drunk, but not sloppy. "Heard a rumor," he slurred. "Heard you've been prayin' with the preacher's girl in ways the good Lord wouldn't like." Mora stiffened, turned to face him. "You heard wrong," Cutter chuckled. "Maybe, maybe not. But a town like this don't need poison like you slippin' between pews." She tried to pass him, tried to walk away like she always had. But this time, he grabbed her arm, and something inside Mora snapped. She'd survived cities, wars, and men worse than Amos Cutter. But the idea of someone speaking Ruth's name with venom, dragging her into the filth, staining what little innocence they had left, that was too much. She shoved him hard, sent him stumbling into the chairs, glass shattering at his feet. "Don't touch me," she growled. But Cutter didn't take kindly to being embarrassed by a woman. He lunged, rage in his eyes, and Mora reached under the piano, where the velvet-wrapped revolver waited like an old friend. She fired once, just once. The sound cracked through the town like thunder on a clear day. When the sheriff arrived, Mora was sitting on the floor, the gun beside her, blood spattered on her shirt. Cutter was slumped against the wall, breathing, barely. Not dead, not yet. The sheriff said nothing, just looked at her like a man who'd already made up his mind. Then he hauled her to her feet, dragged her to the jail, and locked her behind iron bars without so much as a question. Word spread fast. The saloon whore finally snapped, they said. She tried to kill him in cold blood. No one asked why. No one asked what really happened. Except Ruth. She came in the dead of night, hooded, shaking. Her face pale as the moon, hands gripping the bars like she could pull them apart. "What did they do to you?" she whispered. Mora smiled through a split lip. "What they always do." "I'm going to fix this," Ruth said, voice breaking. Mora leaned close. "You can't." "I have to. Because that's the thing about love. It makes you believe in impossible things. It makes you think one voice can be louder than a whole town of cowards." Ruth rode to the mayor's house that night, pleaded for a hearing, spoke of self-defense, but he laughed in her face. "You think the word of a preacher's daughter will save that woman? You'll ruin yourself, girl." And there it was. The choice: stand up for Mora and become the very thing her father feared, or stay silent and watch the woman she loved hang for defending herself. I've faced that choice before, not in a courtroom, not in a saloon, but in the quiet places of my life where I had to decide who I really was. And I watched Ruth weigh that same silence in her hands like a Bible too heavy to lift. The next morning, she didn't go to church. She went to the sheriff's office, walked in proud, eyes red from sleeplessness. Her father looked up from his desk, mouth hard as ever. "I'm here to confess," she said. "To what?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. Ruth took a deep breath. "To loving Mora, and to not being ashamed." For a long moment, nothing moved. Not the clock, not the dust in the sunbeam, not even the breath in her father's chest. And then something in his face changed. Not softened, hardened. "I see," he said. And that's when I knew blood was coming. The West never forgives women who speak too loud, especially not for love. If love meant losing your name, your father, the only home you ever knew, would you still say it out loud? Would you still choose her? I remember the morning Ruth told the town, not just her father, not just Mora behind the bars, everyone. The square was full. Sundays always were. People dressed up in stiff collars and polished boots. Faces turned toward the chapel like that building could cleanse what they did behind closed doors. The church bell rang, slow and hollow, and the preacher stood on the steps with a Bible in one hand and the other resting over his chest, like the truth might leap out and stab him if he wasn't careful. But Ruth didn't go to the chapel. She stood in the dirt between the saloon and the general store, hair pinned back, hands clenched. People started to notice. Whispers floated on the breeze. And then she spoke, loud enough for every single soul in Calico Creek to hear. "I love her." No shaking, no stuttering. Just those 3 words. "I love her, and I won't pretend I don't. Not to save myself. Not to make you comfortable." The preacher froze. Mothers gasped and pulled their children closer like love was a sickness you could catch just by hearing it. The sheriff stepped out from the jailhouse door. Slow, deliberate, like he already knew where this was headed. He walked right up to her, his boots kicking dust over her shoes. He looked her in the eye, and in that moment, you'd have thought he was staring down a murderer. "You come back inside now," he said, his voice low. But Ruth didn't move. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, and for the first time in his life, he looked like he believed her. He turned to the crowd. "My daughter is unwell," he said. "She's been led astray by a woman with no decency, no past, and no future. This ends today." He reached for her arm, rough and fast. But Ruth stepped back, and that's when she said it. The words that would split her life in 2. "If you put her on trial, you'll have to put me on that stand. I'll tell them what happened. I'll tell them she was protecting herself. And I'll tell them I was there, because I came to see her, because I chose her." Silence fell like ash. No one moved. Not even the wind dared stir. The sheriff's jaw clenched. "You'd shame your own blood." And Ruth, trembling now but still standing, said, "You did that when you taught me to fear love more than hate." He didn't speak again, just turned, walked back into the jail. The crowd scattered in waves, some in disgust, some in disbelief. But a few, just a few, looked at Ruth the way Mora once had, like she was something worth saving. That night, the saloon was empty. No music, no voices, just me and the keys, and Ruth, sitting across from Mora in the cell, her hands wrapped around hers like she was holding something sacred. Mora stared at her, eyes full of sadness and wonder. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes, I did," Ruth said, "because if I don't fight for this, for you, then what the hell have I been living for?" Mora cried then, the kind of tears that don't fall pretty, the kind you don't wipe away. I watched from the hall. I shouldn't have, but I did, because it reminded me of the one time someone stood for me, the one time someone dared to say, "She matters." It changes you, being chosen. The sheriff didn't speak to Ruth again that week, didn't let her in the house, told the neighbors she was staying with cousins in the next town over. But we all knew better. 3 days later, Mora was released. No charges filed. Amos Cutter had slipped away in the night, too ashamed or too afraid to face what he'd done. But they still whispered. They still looked. They still blamed her. And Ruth? She walked beside her down Main Street, head held high, her hand brushing Mora's, just enough to say, "I'm still here." And me? I sat on the steps of the saloon that evening, watching the sun dip behind the hills, the honeysuckle catching fire in the light. The scent was everywhere. That night, they kissed under the stars, on the same bench where Ruth had first listened to Mora's song. No hiding, no fear, just two women claiming space in a world that had never made room for them. But I knew something they didn't. The West doesn't forgive easy. And love, no matter how loud you shout it, still bleeds when the world decides it's wrong. If love asked you to walk away from the only world you've ever known, would you take that step? If it meant losing your name, your past, your people, would you still reach for her hand? I ask, not because I don't know the answer, but because I do. And sometimes knowing hurts more than wondering ever did. It was the last warm night before the cold settled in for good. You could feel it in the air, like something shifting under the surface, quiet but certain. Calico Creek had gone still. Even the wind seemed cautious, as if it knew change was coming. And change out here always costs something. Ruth and Mora sat behind the saloon, backs against the honeysuckle-covered wall, fingers laced together like they were trying to hold the world still. No words passed between them. None were needed. They had survived the stares, the sermons, the silence. But survival is not the same as living, and both of them knew. Staying meant dying slow. Mora was the first to say it. Her voice was steady, but her throat trembled. "We can't stay." Ruth didn't answer at first. She just stared at the horizon, where the hills met the stars and time had no edges. Then she whispered, "I know." They had talked about it before, quietly, half joking, heading west, further west, past the reach of names and fathers and church bells, a place where no one knew what Ruth had been expected to become, a place where Mora wouldn't have to keep a pistol under the piano just to feel safe. But saying it now, out loud, made it real, and real meant loss. Ruth went home that night, one last time. She didn't pack much, just a worn Bible, a lock of her mother's hair, and the last note Mora had written her. She left a letter on her father's desk, folded neat. No anger, no accusations, just the truth. "I still love you," she wrote, "but I cannot be what you need me to be. I have found someone who sees me, not who I pretend to be, but who I am. I hope one day you will understand." She didn't wait for morning. By dawn, they were gone. 2 horses, 1 trail, no destination except away. I watched them leave from the hill above the town. Didn't say goodbye, didn't need to. Some things are too sacred for farewells. And I remember wondering, as their silhouettes faded into the rising light, will they make it? Will the world let them? I don't have an answer. Life doesn't wrap itself in ribbons like the books say. Some folks say they heard tell of two women running a little tavern by the river in Colorado. Others say one of them was seen in San Francisco, playing piano, in a place where nobody asked who you were before you came. But me, I think they made it. Not because the world is kind, but because they were. Because they chose love when it cost them everything. Because they didn't wait for permission. Because they took what little time they had and filled it with something true. That's the thing about forbidden love. It burns fast, bright. It doesn't always last. But it leaves something behind. Ashes that still glow if you look close enough. And sometimes, if the wind is just right, I swear I can still smell honeysuckle, still hear the echo of a soft hymn on piano keys, still see the girl who stopped being a preacher's daughter and became something far braver. So, if you had to choose between honor and love, between staying safe and stepping into the unknown, what would you do? Because out here in the West, every story ends the same way. With a choice, and with blood, and with honeysuckle blooming where no one thought it should.